Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And we are going to have a lot of fun with today's episode.
Yes.
We have a returning guest with us today. We have Hugh Yemen. If for our longtime listeners who've been with us for a while, he did episode number 59 with us, so quite a bit ago. And that episode was on the abolitionist Moses Summers, who is buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Syracuse, New York. So if you're interested after today's episode, if you hadn't heard that one before, go on back, listen to that one. It was a fascinating episode. Hugh did so much research into Moses and his life. And Diane, you went back and re-listened to it just recently.
I listened to it over this weekend, but I forgot what an amazing episode it was, and just the work that Hugh put into literally digging really deep in Moses's history, and just the fascination of his work as an abolitionist, and maybe how things didn't go so well with some family members. So it was really fascinating to go back and listen to it, because it was like one of our first
within our first year of doing this. We are excited to welcome you back to the show, Hugh. Thank you so much. We are doing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Hugh.
Oh, I just said thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so excited. We are especially excited because we are doing something we haven't done before on this podcast. And this was at Hugh's suggestion. And both Diane and I said, you know what, let's do something different. So Hugh has prepared an episode for us today that we don't know anything about. We have no idea what the topic is, other than that it's related to a cemetery. But we don't know the story. We know nothing. We told Hugh, he did not have to tell us. So you, the audience, will get to go along with us as we react to what Hugh's been researching this time and going to tell us all about. So we are very excited for this, I think.
Well, I'm excited to be here. Like I said, this is the first time I've been on somebody else's podcast as the person who is telling the story that they don't know about. And I'm really excited to see how it works out. So this is a story that I dug up just, I think, by virtue of spending a lot of time, for whatever reason, in Omaha, Nebraska newspapers. At least that's my guess. I don't even remember how I stumbled upon this.
There are a lot of those. Do you use like newspapers.com for part of your research?
Now, I wasn't when I stumbled upon this.
Oh, okay.
I was using primarily Fulton History and Chronicling America, along with a whole bunch of other more local databases.
I just feel like they have digitized the Omaha, and actually a lot of the Nebraska papers have done a really good job of digitizing their old records. So I can see where you would stumble across it, even when you're researching something completely not related to the
Omaha Daily Bee was amazing. I actually read Thornton Burgess bedtime stories to my daughter from 100 years ago.
I love
it. From the Omaha Daily Bee. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
How fun.
So to start this story, I want to frame it in a particular way because it's going to get so bonkers.
Oh, no.
That it's going to seem like I'm making light of everything. So I want to really frame this in a way that accentuates the sadness. Okay. So I'm going to start with a terrible tragedy, because that's actually where this starts. Fort Smith, Arkansas, January 14th, 1898. This is from the front page of the Fort Smith elevator. 50 persons are dead. Terrific cyclone struck the city Tuesday night at 11:15 and left death, destruction, and fire in its trail. Damage to property cannot be estimated. Churches, residences, and business houses demolished. Hundreds of people without food or shelter. I'm not going to try to read the rest of that article because I really want to save my more exhaustive readings of articles for when this really gets nuts. But the headings that I just read pretty much tell you all you need to know. And on column 5, there is a list of the dead. And Among those names, this is the one that we're going to be focusing on, is one Etta Kis, Ettakis. They
Okay.
misspelled it frequently as Keis, so if you want to look into this, know that. So you've got this horrific tragedy, very sudden, and if you follow the Fort Smith elevator, you will see in the following days an all too detailed map of the swath of destruction that this cyclone left. So again, terrible tragedy. So in the following days, there were some articles. This one is from January 14th, 1898. The remains of Mrs. Kis were prepared for burial by the ladies of the Woodmen circle, and her funeral will occur today from the morgue. The deceased has an uncle and aunt living at Mayfield, Kentucky, and they have been advised of the untimely death of their relative. Keep that in mind. Relatives, Mayfield, Kentucky. Miss Etta Kis was a very popular young lady and for a time worked in the millinery department of the Boston store under Mrs. Smith. She was rooming in the Smith building when she met her death with the other victims buried in the ruins of that structure. Notice the funeral of Miss Etta Kis will take place today at 3 o'clock from the residence of Mrs. E.M. Johnson, 117 4th Street. The members of Oak Grove number 10, Woodman Circle, will please assemble at 2 o'clock at the residence of Mrs. Johnson. All members requested to attend. Services by Reverend O.L. Haley. Here's another. The ladies of the Woodman Circle have taken charge of the remains of Miss Etta Estelle Kis, and the unfortunate young lady will be given a very nice burial. Mrs. Smith, the Boston store's milliner, for whom Miss Kis worked for a time, has prepared a handsome burial shroud and a beautiful white casket will encase the remains. The casket was provided by the Woodman Circle. Here's where I want to stop and make sure we have proper context. Spitballing here, how much would you say your average listener knows about the Woodmen?
Is it Woodmen of the World?
I was going to say we did an episode on them.
Yeah.
Last year because they were one of the
fraternal
organization. Well, I don't know. Did we do an episode or we did a blog? Something we've talked about them before, but yes. Yeah. And that began in Omaha, actually.
Yep.
That organization.
Yeah, this is all relevant. The Woodmen, it took me a long time to figure out what I was looking at when I was interested in those tree grave markers. I had no idea for years. I just gravitated toward them because I thought, oh, wow, somebody really liked trees. Hey, person after my own heart. And so I saw them, and it was only because of a conversation in my Syracuse history group that I realized that it wasn't just an aesthetic thing. It was a signifier of a fraternal order.
Yes.
And the more I researched this, the more interested I became because, as you say, they were based in Omaha, and it was not only a fraternal order, it was an insurance company. And I'm going to go ahead and call it a gimmick because I'm pretty cynical, and that's the lens through which I view a lot of things in history. It boils down to gimmicks. The whole gimmick of, if you're a member of the Woodmen, when you die, you get a grave marker that's worth at least $100. That was the thing. They stopped doing that in later years, but that's the factoid that everybody knew about them.
Right.
And it's the factoid that people today still know about them. And in my research, I've found that was a bit overstated, at least insofar as the arboreal theme of the grave markers, because as you'll be seeing, it's not as consistent as I had assumed. So now we've got 1898, the 15th, the funeral of Miss Kis has been postponed till Sunday, etc. So we don't hear a lot about Miss Etta Kis for the next few months. Then we're going to April 1st, 1898. Mr. W.L. Warren last week received from the Woodmen Circle the sum of $500, which represented the policy carried in that order by Miss Etta Kis, one of the victims of last January's cyclone. Miss Kis had but one relative in the world, and that a very distant one. but it was to provide for any contingency that might arise that she joined the circle. Now, this is where it starts to get nuts. 1899, not 1898 anymore. We're jumping forward some months. 1899, October 5th. This is again from Fort Smith. That monument, Miss Friselle removed it yesterday. Her action caused much excitement among the woodmen of the world and Woodmen's Circle. There is blood on the moon. Sometime during the day, a committee of ladies from the Laurel Grove Woodmen's Circle will appear before the grand jury and make complaint against Miss Agnes Friselle for an alleged desecration of a grave. According to the story, Miss Friselle, who is well known in this city, went out to the city cemetery late yesterday afternoon with two Negroes and toppled over the monument recently erected on the grave of Miss Estelle Kis by the Woodmen's Circle. It so happened that a young girl, the daughter of an Avenue businesswoman, saw the Negroes at work and telephoned some members of Laurel Grove. The news created intense excitement among the members of the Woodmen of the World, as well as the ladies' division of that order. Miss Kis was killed during the cyclone and was a member of the Oak Grove Circle in good standing at the time of her death. Since then, dissensions arose in the circle, which culminated in the withdrawal of a large portion of the membership and the institution of the Laurel Grove Circle. Miss Friselle then withdrew from the order and burned the charter of the Oak Grove.
Whoa.
There was great delay in furnishing the monument for the grave of Miss Kis, and it was only but put in place last week. Yesterday evening, as stated, Miss Friselle went to the city cemetery and had the monument removed from the grave. This morning, a committee of ladies from Laurel Grove Circle called upon a prominent attorney to seek legal advice. The committee was told that if Miss Friselle had acted as they described, the matter was one which it was the duty of the grand jury to act upon, and the ladies left the attorney's office to go to the grand jury room. In this case, as in all others, there are two sides to the question. While the parties at interest declined to say anything concerning the transaction, some of their friends are not so close-mouthed. A gentleman connected with the city and who is a warm adherent of Miss Friselle said this morning, the publication in the morning paper was simply an outrage and should not be permitted to go unnoticed. There is not a particle of truth in the statement made therein. The facts in the case are about these. As is well known, there has been a great deal of bitter feeling vented in the controversy which arose in Oak Grove Circle, which culminated in the destruction of that circle and the organization of the Laurel Grove. That has become a matter of ancient history. Miss Kis was a member of Oak Grove Circle, and Miss Friselle took an active interest in the matter of the monument. It appears that the girl left $500. Her aunt, who lives out of the state, was written to by Miss Friselle and asked what should be done with the money. And the aunt, who is administrator of the dead girl's estate, replied that it should be expended in beautifying the grave and in aiding the erection of the monument. As there was an additional $100 to be donated by the order, nothing was done by Miss Friselle, she waiting for action on the part of the lodge with reference to the donation of the stipulated $100. She went out to the grave yesterday and found that someone had placed a monument there. It is claimed that the monument did not come up to the specifications, and seeing that to be the case, Miss Friselle concluded that the wishes of the aunt should be carried into effect by having a suitable monument erected on the grave, and simply went to the grave for the purpose of removing the stone placed by the Laurel Grove, preparatory to the substitution of a much finer one. The friends of Miss Friselle disclaim all intention on her part to desecrate the grave and invest her with a desire to see the grave of her one-time sister properly beautified. They decline to discuss the matter. Attorneys differ, yada, yada, yada. Any person who shall willfully and maliciously destroy, injure, or deface any grave or any monument erected or placed to mark the place of interment of any deceased person, or shall who fully and maliciously remove or destroy any enclosure erected for protection of any such grave or monument, on conviction thereof shall be punished by imprisonment in the penitentiary for a term not less than 2 or more than 5 years. Got the mayor and the chief involved, going out to the city cemetery, people claiming there was no act of vandalism. So already we're starting with this back and forth snowballing of ego and posturing between two sides of an internecine squabble between two Woodmen factions.
Yes.
October 5th, 1899. Take notice to Laurel Grove Woodmen Circle, number 8, and Meddlers. To Mrs. Mary M. Lefevre and Miss Agnes Friselle, legally authorized, hereby forbid Laurel Grove Woodmen Circle, number 18, and other meddlers from further trespass upon the burial lot of Miss Estelle Kis in the city cemetery. So as this progresses, this guy named Root gets involved. He was a newspaper editor. He wrote an article on, I believe it was October 4th, and it's driven me absolutely nuts that I've been completely unable to find it. I've contacted any number of historians around the Fort Smith area. As far as I can tell, that newspaper doesn't exist anymore, but this is what really kicked this into high gear.
Uh-oh.
And here's the thing, that name Root happened to be the same name of a founding member of the Woodmen organization in Omaha. So the newspapers got it confused and thought that this Root guy who had slandered Friselle was this same Root of Woodmen fame. So the confusion over this case is compounding along with the posturing and litigiousness of it. So now I'm going to go to, let me see, 1899. Yeah, let's go to 1899, December 1st. Women quarrel over a tombstone. 100 women are quarreling, and a lodge has been rent in twain at Fort Smith, Arkansas, on account of a tombstone. The women are members of Laurel Grove Circle, the Order of the Woodmen of the World. Last year, Miss Estelle Kis, one of their most popular members, died. In accordance with their custom, they set about buying a tombstone for the deceased sister, but dissensions arose in the lodge. One faction wanted a more costly tombstone than the other. There were bickering and long disputes. One evening, Miss Agnes Friselle, a prominent member, rose and declared the lodge disbanded, their charter forfeited, and their rights lost. With that, she left the room, and her following went with her and organized a new lodge. The remnants of the old lodge remained and declared that it was intact, no matter how many renegades chose to desert. Then both factions bought a tombstone for Miss Estelle Kis. Miss Friselle's reaction sent out of town. Oh, sorry. Miss Friselle's faction sent out of town for their tombstone. The party headed by Mrs. Westfall patronized home industry and got its tombstone the sooner. Mrs. Westfall's party erected its tombstone, and the date was fixed 10 days ago to unveil the monument. Miss Friselle's party anticipated this movement, which would have been a final one. Their tombstone had arrived. Meanwhile, and they went to the cemetery late on the afternoon of the 3rd instant, took down the first monument, set it aside, opened the grave, and removed the body to another lot, and erected their out-of-town and more valuable tombstone over it. Now Mrs. Westfall's half of the lodge proposes to have Miss Friselle's half arrested for desecration of a grave. Miss Friselle retorts that Mrs. Lefevre, the dead girl's sister, was of her half of the lodge and party to the charge of dead stones. Did they call them dead stones, or is that a typo?
No, I think I've heard that term before.
Dead stones. Okay.
Yeah.
Both factions have retained lawyers because, of course, they have.
You know what I find so interesting about this is this was a young single woman. Like, she wasn't married. She didn't have children. She had one living relative in Kentucky.
Far away. Yeah.
And yet they are just fighting over her grave and who put up the better tombstone.
It sounds like your brain is operating along the same lines as mine is, because in the absence of relatives, it feels like all of these other factors came into play, and that's what I'm trying to tease out in my investigation.
Yeah.
Now, you know, we've talked a lot about desecration of the grave.
Right.
I want to put that in context because you and I in 2024, talking about desecration of the grave, our minds do not go remotely in the same direction as a person living in 1899.
Sure.
Their mind would have gone in very different directions because you got to remember, desecration of the grave was an enormous deal dating back at least as far as 1850. I don't know how far back it went before that because most of my research focuses on that sweet spot, but I've done a ton of research into grave robbing in Syracuse around 1850, 1851. This was when the divide between the homeopathic and allopathic schools of medicine was really getting fierce.
Right.
And the allopathic school was really trying to legitimize itself. And one of the ways in which it was doing that was paying people for bodies.
Yep.
How else were they going to do their empirically minded medical highfalutin research?
Right.
But by doing that, so these bodies were feeding the medical schools. So there were countless stories about, didn't they call them resurrection men?
Mm-hmm.
I think they, yeah.
Yep.
I was trying to think of that term last night. So this act of desecration had a different cachet to
right.
it, a much more culturally charged sense of outrage than it would today. I think people today would just be like, well, why? What? But people of that time was like, oh, they dug up my relative's body for money and gave it to some doctor. So there was so much emotion surrounding that. And we've already touched upon the other factor, which is this fraternal order. And again, I don't feel like people today can understand. I certainly couldn't understand the significance of fraternal orders because, 10 years ago, just like most people, I thought, well, fraternal orders, well, you got the Masons and that's about it. No, the Masons were just one in a
right.
freaky bouquet of sort of chivalric fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And my pet theory, and this is just me again spitballing. I don't know how true this is, but this is just how I see it. A whole generation of men died in the Civil War, and when they came back, literally until the day they died, they were involved in parades and pageantry.
Mm-hmm.
And they shot off the guns, and the sons of those men watched all that pageantry, and they absolutely had to have that for themselves. They didn't have such a grand and violent affair as the Civil War to fight themselves, but they needed something. And I think that fraternal orders filled that need because one thing I noticed when I was first researching this was I couldn't get my head around how seriously these people were taking themselves with all the names of all the positions within the fraternal orders that sound like the apotheosis of absurdity to my ears. But when I saw pictures from the early 20th century, it really clicked with me how seriously these people took themselves.
Well, yeah, they had uniforms and ceremony, and it was a big deal to be in at least one organization, and several members were usually more than one organization. There were a lot of times people belonged to several of them.
Yeah. So in place of familial umbrage, let's say, we have fraternal umbrage in this case. So now I'm going to skip forward to 1901.
So the original incident happened in 1897. So now we're in 1901. Okay. I was trying to figure out time-wise where we were at.
Chief of Woodmen, mulcted. Love that word. It's a word you never hear anymore. Joseph C. Root loses $14,000 in an Omaha suit for libel.
Wow.
Omaha, December 12th. A verdict in favor of Miss Agnes Friselle of Fort Smith, Arkansas, was returned last evening in the federal court in the suit against Joseph C. Root, sovereign commander of the Woodmen of the world, and others, for a publication in the Tidings, which she alleged was libelous. It arose through a controversy over the placing of a tombstone at the grave of Miss Estelle Kis, a victim of an Arkansas cyclone. Damages in the sum of $14,000 were awarded. It's quite a sum of money in 1901.
Even
And
now,
again,
that's a big sum.
yeah. And again, note that there's a lot of confusion in this newspaper article because they're conflating Joseph C. Root, the
Right.
editor of this newspaper in Fort Smith, with the Joseph C. Root of the Woodmen. So there's a lot of errors creeping in already.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I apologize. I skipped
No, you're
one.
fine.
We're going back to 1899, November 2nd, and this one in particular, I'm going to ask you to point your viewers to because it has an illustration.
Ooh.
And this is one of the most fascinating things to me. You can go to Find a Grave, and I'm going to include that link and the image from Find a Grave, and you can see the monument. It's still there today, the one that Friselle was responsible for. It's impressive, but it's not anything you would write home about. You look at that and you think, oh, late 19th century gravestone for someone who had some money but wasn't rich. That's it.
Okay.
You look at the illustration of the one that was replaced, I would argue that it's not necessarily any better or any worse. It's just a little different. It's not quite as ornate in its form. It's just sort of a rectangular prism with a sort of triangular cap. And I would argue that the one that they took down was actually more decorative. Like there's more ornate carving on the face of it, whereas the form of the second one, just in terms of classical structure, is just a little bit more elaborate. But they're comparable. They're not that different. So that's one of the funny things about this argument. It seems to me like it was just about fraternal ego. The wounded pride of one faction against another in this internecine war.
It almost makes you wonder if at some point in one of their meetings, and probably the meeting where half the group walked out, they had been trying to decide on what monument to go with, what they were going to use. And I feel like the part of their disagreement came down to who wanted which monument and who felt they were right about which was the most appropriate monument to put on this poor girl's grave.
Yeah, and it was just like the initial erection of a gravestone was almost like a snowball that you kick down a hill, and it ended up in this monstrous snowball the size of a house. It was just nuts. Now,
well, and like you said, they brought egos, all the egos came into it. So
yeah. All right. Now, here is the culmination of all of this bonkers progression. 1902, December 23rd. This is from the St. Louis Republic, and it's right on Chronicling America. You can see it easy as anything. Woman fires shot in the courtroom.
Oh no.
Miss Agnes Friselle suddenly interrupts slander trial at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Wild pandemonium follows. Defendant's counsel denounces the court, and a moment later draws a revolver on the young woman's brother.
Oh no.
Republic Special, Fort Smith, Arkansas, December 22nd. Miss Agnes Friselle was taking a leading part in the prosecution of A.C. Root on the charge of criminal slander, suddenly interrupted the court proceedings this afternoon by firing a shot from a revolver, presumably at the defendant. I love it. Presumably at the defendant. The bullet barely grazed the head of Colonel Brizzolara, leading counsel for the defense, but did no further damage. Root
Thankfully.
fled from the court. Root fled from the courtroom quite precipitately. I love the language. And asked to be locked up in jail for protection. After a brief imprisonment, his friends induced him to return to his home. Shortly after the shooting, Colonel Brizzolara, sorry, can't say that, denounced the court for permitting such conduct in the courtroom. A few minutes later, the colonel had a set-to with James Friselle, a brother of the plaintiff in the suit, and they drew their revolvers in the courtroom. But
Oh, no.
bloodshed was averted by the prompt action of the chief of police, who was present and disarmed them both. The men left the building in opposite directions, but if they should meet on the street, a killing might follow. Excitement is running high, and no one can tell what the night will bring forth. Newspaper writers loved this stuff.
Oh, I'm sure.
The trial of the slander case was called this morning. Nearly the whole of the day was taken up by the hearing of the evidence. Miss Friselle sat at the table with her attorneys and actively engaged in the prosecution of the case, not only suggesting important matters to her counsel, but frequently engaging in the questioning herself. When all of the testimony was in this afternoon, the court asked the attorneys how much time they desired in which to make their arguments. Miss Friselle arose and replied that the plaintiff desired an hour and a half. Judge Bryant of the counsel for the defense remarked that he pitied the jury if that much time was to be consumed, that the defense desired only half an hour. Miss Friselle replied that a woman's character was at stake and plenty of time should be allowed. Colonel Brizzolara, who had been watching Miss Friselle, had gone into an anteroom to warn Root of danger. As he came out, he heard Miss Friselle's statement, and he loudly objected to any such remark in the presence of the jury. He had scarcely finished speaking when a shot rang out. Pandemonium reigned. There was instant pandemonium. Everyone in the courtroom arose and made a dash for the doors. Colonel Brizzolara, seeing a revolver in the hands of Miss Friselle, seized her arm and wrested the weapon away from her before she could fire a second shot. Instantly, they were surrounded by court officers who seemed to think that the colonel was trying to kill her. After firing the shot, Miss Friselle became hysterical and completely collapsed. She was removed from the courtroom to her home, where her condition is said to be serious. When the smoke cleared away, Colonel Brizzolara took occasion to denounce the court in the following language. This court, through its vacillating conduct during this and the Westfall trials, is responsible for this violation of all court decorum. This court can impose a fine upon me for contempt if it so desires. When Judge Rowe recovered from his astonishment, he replied, I am not responsible. You are responsible and wholly responsible, continued Colonel Brizzolara, and I so assert without any qualification whatever. You may fine me for contempt if you want to. Another struggle! Colonel Brizzolara, while talking to Chief of Police Fuller later on, was approached by James Friselle, who made inquiry concerning the court incident and intimated that if Colonel Brizzolara said anything concerning his sister, he would be held personally responsible. Colonel Brizzolara drew a pistol, saying that he had said nothing about Friselle's sister, but was ready to be held accountable for anything. Friselle also drew his gun. Chief Fuller disarmed them both, and they departed in opposite directions. The slander suit grew out of statements made by Root, who was then publishing a paper here, reflecting on the character of Miss Agnes Friselle. As soon as Miss Friselle fired, Root, finding himself unhurt, left the courtroom in haste and went to the county jail, where he asked to be locked up. Later, he was driven to the home of Colonel Brizzolara, his chief counsel. Colonel Brizzolara refuses to leave the street, and as James Friselle is also without fear, there may be trouble between the two if they meet again. Miss Friselle is at her home quite ill, the result of the reaction. The bullet just grazed Colonel Brizzolara's head, but the supposition is that the shot was intended for Root. Excitement resulting from the incident is running high.
To think all of this over a headstone.
Yeah, and I want to stop here and say, now this might be obvious to the average person because the average person has a much higher situational awareness than I do. But I don't know how many hours of research on this. And the whole time I was just sort of going on autopilot with my assumptions. And I got to the end of this and it suddenly hit me like a brick None of these people were related to the deceased.
No.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. I was like, this was
Because
a young single woman.
I am so accustomed to reading this type of article and having it be all about familial relations, familiar honor violated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But no, none of these people who are whipping out guns in the courtroom and then tracking down each other in the streets with guns afterwards, none of them were related to the woman about whose grave this whole thing started. So it was about a case of libel. It was about the fraternal order. It was about desecration of the grave. Now, it could have stopped there, but like a lot of my investigations, I can't leave any stone unturned when I feel like there's more threads to tease out. So I don't remember what it was, but some combination of keywords brought me to an article that uncovered a few things about Friselle's past, and I think this sheds some light on the subject.
That's kind of what I was wondering, because Friselle herself sounds like quite a firecracker.
That's
Yeah.
putting it nicely.
And
Now
so,
I'm going. Yeah, go ahead.
so I was like, and obviously, I feel like she must have been very good friends with the deceased. Like, in order for her to put herself through all of this as the living
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
there was something very special about Etta that she was willing to go through all of this.
See, that I don't know. Of course, with our modern minds, there's speculation that pops up about what might have been that relationship, but I have no proof, no
Well,
evidence.
no, I'm just saying, I think, for maybe they were just really good friends, or she just felt like since nobody else was there to fight for Etta, there was no family to make sure Etta was
Right.
taken care of. So she brought it upon herself to do this
Right.
for this girl for whatever reason.
See, I see something different. I see the money for the headstone, the money for the insurance policy, that somehow they could, whoever maybe got the stone or was able to place the stone would be the beneficiary if there was money left over. I'm seeing money.
For the first stone, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah. That's also a good thought.
I didn't even think of that. See, this is where inflation affects my historical interpretation, because unless I am doing those calculations in real time every time I read a sentence,
right,
I forget how much money that was.
Right.
That was, somewhere on the order of a couple $100, which at that time you multiply by about what, 24, 25?
Probably.
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah. So here's what I found about Friselle's history. Going back to 1883. This is in Denison, Texas.
Okay.
She's from Denison, Texas. The following are the appointments for professor and teachers in the public schools for the ensuing year. White School. And then I'm going down the list to Miss Agnes Friselle. So she was a teacher in Denison, Texas.
Okay.
And then, not long later, this is from the Sunday Gazette in Denison, Texas. There was a special meeting of the city council last Saturday week for the purpose of giving Miss Agnes Friselle, the teacher who was discharged a short time since, an opportunity to put in her defense. The charge on which she was removed was cruelty to the children.
Oh.
Colonel H.C. Foster was present as her attorney, and the testimony of a number of her pupils and their parents was offered in her defense. The charges made before the school board, which led to her dismissal, were not sustained to the satisfaction of the council, and on motion were withdrawn. This reinstated Miss Friselle, and next Monday she resumes charge of her department in the school.
Interesting.
Now, there's another article about her litigiousness. And if I could find that, you know what, I'm just going to tell you about it. I'll include that in the notes.
Perfect.
She was involved in one of a million lawsuits against city railways when she fell off a platform. It's the type you see in 19th century newspapers all the time. But the point is, she seemed quite forceful in her litigiousness. She was far from afraid, even back in the 1880s, she was far from afraid of taking lawsuits as far as she needed to take them.
Wow.
And then fast forward to 1890, again, this is 8 years before the hurricane. The Fort Smith elevator has a little article. The lecture recently delivered by Miss Agnes Friselle at Denison, Texas, will shortly be repeated in this city. And here's another article from the same paper around the same time. The Denison Dispatch has the following concerning one of our most talented ladies. Miss Agnes Friselle will deliver a lecture on women's rights at the Philosophical Hall today at 3 p.m. So put all this together. You've got a woman from Texas who was a school teacher, who was a strict disciplinarian and an authoritarian at the very least. If she got in that much trouble with the parents and the council for supposedly being cruel to the children.
Especially at that time.
Yeah, you got a woman who was authoritative and well-known enough to give a lecture on women's rights in 1890, and a woman who was obviously litigious. Now, here's another instance of the way I study history is through, I ask questions, and I think I annoy some people because I'm just sort of a combination of analytical and speculative. I ask questions that might not be answerable, but then I go digging, and sometimes I don't find an answer, but sometimes I find some really interesting gleanings from like historical surveys in the form of broad swaths of newspaper databases, right, and stuff like that. So it's an approach that I find rewarding. And here's a sort of a general question that I ask myself: well, could her origins in Texas have had anything to do with this seemingly shocking whipping out of a gun in the courtroom? And that's one of those questions that gets you in trouble because it relies upon modern stereotypes.
Right.
And I want to say this just as an example. I want to throw this out there. If you go to my podcast, one of the episodes is about Irish soda bread. If you do a significant amount of research into Irish soda bread, all of the online sources will tell you a story about how Irish soda bread originates around 1835. It is characteristic of Ireland and the particular shortages of this mineral and that foodstuff at the time, and they brought this tradition over with them. Everybody knows Irish soda bread is a specifically Irish thing. I did an absurd amount of research on Irish soda bread. Do you know that I cannot find a reference to Irish soda bread before 1912?
I'm not surprised.
It's one of the countless examples of this sort of thing that I've found in my research. What we think we know about events 100 years ago or 200 years ago or whatever, that supposed knowledge is only a story that people started telling relatively recently. It's like we make up the past as we go along by crafting these stories that are complete post hoc fiction. So that's why I say I'm speculating about, well, maybe the fact that she came from Texas was why the people in Nebraska were not prepared for someone to react the way she did. But I could be way off. For all I know, the gun culture in Texas was no more intense than the gun culture in Nebraska at that time. I haven't specialized in that region. My historical research focuses on New York State. So I don't know. That's just a question I ask myself. Then the women's rights thing, that brings me back to
Well, this was all in Fort Smith, though, right? Arkansas. This was taking place in Arkansas. Her story.
Everything from the cyclone on happened in and around Fort Smith.
Fort Smith. And that particular fort was like the sort of the edge of the Western frontier at the time. So I mean, they were a little more used to like gunslingers and stuff, but probably not a woman slinging her gun around the courtroom. But that was probably a little bit more of a shocker that she pulled out a revolver and, you know, let her temper get the better of her in that moment.
Right, right, right. Well, see, here's where I go back to all of the studying on the Civil War that I've done, because people responded so violently to any imputation of one's character. And
Mhm.
what I keep thinking of when I study this event is the caning of Charles Sumner in 1856. Now, by contrast, and once again we go back to family. This the guy Brooks who assaulted Sumner, nearly killed him
Right.
on the floor of the Senate. Brooks did that not only because Sumner was insulting his way of life, which on its own was intolerable to people at that time. He also did it because Sumner insulted his family. It was a family thing. So, again, by contrast, here we have Friselle responding with such umbrage that she actually had a gravestone removed. Then, once the libel comes in, she responds even more aggressively and eventually violently. It feels to me like all of this is about slighted honor
Mhm.
that goes at least as far back as the Civil War. I mean, duels were made illegal in what, late 1850s, early 1860s, but
Something like that. Yeah.
that aggressive, violent male culture was obviously still rewarded. And here's where my knowledge of changing women's roles in the late 19th century comes in. I always go back to a exhibit at the Newark Museum, Newark, New Jersey, that I went to 10, 20 years ago about the changing roles of women. It was a magnificent exhibit that so vividly contextualized how those generations of women after the Civil War, who basically had to step up and fill
Right.
a lot of the roles of men just by virtue of the sheer number of men who were killed. And then that sort of provided a wedge. Uh, I feel like there's something of that to this story, where Friselle was part of a generation. This was still decades before women had the right to vote, but there
Right.
were a lot of women who were stepping up and fiercely occupying cultural territory that was previously only occupied by men.
Mhm.
I mean, she was giving a lecture on women's rights, and then 12 years later, she was whipping out a gun in the courtroom. It's like, hey, go ladies! You know, I can do everything a man can do, including being absolutely nuts.
Right. Well, and like you said, women didn't have a choice after the Civil War because they didn't have the men to do things anymore. And their entire way of life changed as much as the men's did and going forward. And I think too, there was just a, a different thought process after the war of how everybody was going to move forward and move on with
Yeah,
life.
yeah, and it's funny to contrast this with the other aspects of those changing roles. In that exhibit that I mentioned in Newark, and the exhibit, you can actually look it up and you can find the companion book to this exhibit on archive.org. It's called Off the Pedestal. They really
You writing it down,
emphasized
Diane? I saw you go through the notes.
they really emphasized the outrage over things that seem silly to us now, like women wearing pants, women bicycling, and
Uh-huh.
especially women reading. There
Oh
was
yes.
such smoldering outrage out of women reading newspapers and being informed because,
Expanding our minds.
yeah, yeah. And it almost feels as though Friselle whipping out a gun in the courtroom was less surprising than the act of, say, a woman reading a book or wearing pants.
Hmm.
I mean, it was as spectacular of a news story as I would have expected for the time, but there's very
Right.
little sense of surprise over a woman doing it. That's the interesting thing about this story. So it pulls in all of those different cultural threads, and that's why I find this so fascinating to try to tease out what am I looking at here when I look at these articles. There's so many cultural and political elements feeding into it.
This kind of takes me back to our discussion we had a couple of weeks ago with Shelby Carr. She had been on the show about Louise Hill, and Louise here in Denver she was the queen of Denver, the social set. She is a woman who grew up or was born at the tail end of the Civil War. So she was part of that generation of women
The
who
South.
from the South who had to make these major changes. And she actually came to Colorado looking for a husband because she couldn't find one in the South because there just weren't enough men. But we were talking in that conversation with Shelby about how that generation of women, that particular group of women, are the ones that kind of paved the way in a lot of respects for the women in the 20s when we finally got the right to vote, and for a lot of the things that we think of more um, historically, as far as how women's rights have moved along. And I think that exhibit that you mentioned and what we talked about with Shelby, that really shows that there's a whole generation of women that were still kind of trying to keep to certain traditional values, yet stepping outside of them because they had to change their role and what they were doing. And I also think after having fought in this, not the women themselves, but like they watched their fathers and their brothers and their husbands and all of that go through this war, it made them rethink how women could be and should be going forward and what roles we actually should be playing in society, as opposed to just
Yeah,
the role of wife and mother. I
yeah,
think.
And then to your point, Hugh, it's like when we read in today's how we think, and we read these articles in those papers from 100 years ago, we can't put today's perspective and I guess our perspective into what
yeah,
was going on into those people's minds then, because we do them such a disservice when we do that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I do think it's interesting when you were reading about how she had gone home and she was ill this whole time. I doubt she was really that ill. She was probably just really angry.
I thought the same thing. I felt like she's obviously this fierce feminist who is also not afraid to stake out territory heretofore only occupied by men. But I got the feeling from that she was not above exploiting the trope of the
Oh
fainting
yeah,
woman.
she was using
Yeah,
what she needed to use to make
yeah,
things happen the way she wanted
yeah,
them to happen.
yeah,
She was
yeah,
smart.
yeah,
Like I said, she was definitely a firecracker.
yeah. So here's what I wanted to say to just bring it back to a 10,000-foot view. I have never seen a better example of why cemeteries are important. I think most people who are not taphophiles don't get it
Mm-hmm.
because they might not understand just how much is bundled up and distilled within cemeteries.
Right.
Cemeteries are a nexus of personalities, of family, society, art, culture, politics, very much politics,
Oh yeah.
everything. And all of that distillation is fueled by a sense of tragedy because I mean everyone says the most stressful things in life are death in the family, moving, and a new job. And I feel like what we're looking at here is the absolute nuttiness that ensues from humans grieving and humans just not always being able to deal rationally with death, you know?
True. Yeah.
So I think this is a good exemplar of what makes cemeteries such a valid lens for historical study.
And definitely why they're worth saving and preserving and
Yeah.
And the
and
stories
making them
that-
available
yeah.
to making them available to the public to try and learn these stories. And for you, like yourself, it started with one article that you read and you just kind of snowballed into this whole drama
Yeah.
that took place
Yeah.
over years over one
Oh,
grave.
and by the way, as far as I know, no one in Fort Smith knew about this until I brought it to their attention. I've talked to any number of historians, and apparently this story, obviously it was sensational at the time, but it wasn't sensational enough to last in the
Right.
public memory.
I'm glad you brought more of
Yeah.
it forward. Do we know where Miss Friselle ended up when she died? Is she buried in the same cemetery or is she somewhere else? Do we know?
I don't think I looked her up. If I did, it's been long enough that I don't remember, but I can.
I might look her up before we put the episode out and then I can let listeners know. But I'm just curious to figure out after all of this, because obviously she did a lot in her lifetime and kept
So
heads
how did
turning.
the case finally end?
Oh yeah. So what was
I'm
the
sorry?
outcome of this
Yeah, what
particular
was the
story?
outcome of the? Yeah.
Well, it culminated in such a spectacular fashion. Anything that happened after that is hardly even worth commenting on. If I'm remembering correctly, they settled for a lesser amount than that $14,000, but it will all be in the notes that I'm going to send you.
Yeah. This was a great episode. I'm so glad you didn't tell us ahead of time what we were about to experience with this story, because it's just been fun to kind of try and wrap our heads around as we've listened to you tell it. Both from
her pulling a derringer, because I'm sure she didn't have a pistol. She would have had a derringer,
out of her little handbag, and
and why she wasn't checked or whatever. It's like a little tiny purse and just pulls it out. And of course, that's what a lady would be carrying. She could be carrying a 6-shooter.
I guess
could be, but
I'm totally picturing her as a woman who was very much if she was a school teacher when she was younger, and those students learned etiquette and they learned all the things she would have taught, so she definitely probably followed all of those rules, and yet she had a definite mindset as to what women could and should do, especially if she was speaking on women's rights. So I have this very interesting picture of her in my mind, not knowing anything about what she actually looked like or anything, but she's definitely one of those women who
I'm thinking of the line from the Terminator. She absolutely will not stop ever.
I love it though. But these are the best stories though. These are the ones that when you start to research them, you come across them. And like you said, this one's been forgotten by history until now, which you brought it back to life. These are the best because these are the human stories. These are what make us human. And we all go through something like this at some point in our life. Maybe not quite as dramatic as that, we're not ending, in a near shootout, but like we all have moments of drama in our life that we can look at the story and relate back to in some way or other and try and figure out why you would be so. And then when you look at it years later, sometimes through a different lens, even when it's a personal story, you're like, why did I get that worked up over this little thing? And like you said, in her case, probably a lot of it had to do with grief and her response to losing a friend, a sister in her organization. And then obviously there was a split within the organization, as happens a lot within those types of groups. People disagree on something and the group split up. So then emotions are running even higher at that point. So
can you imagine what that guy Root must have felt? Like he never could have imagined what he was lighting off when he published that story on October 4th, 1898. 1899. Yeah.
I'm hoping somewhere someone will hear this episode and they'll be going through their attic. They're like, wait, we have all these old newspapers, and they're going to come across it for us so we can finally read his article. Because that's my hope too. Yeah, that's probably the only way we're going to find it is if it's in somebody's attic or somebody's got their china wrapped in it or something, and they're going to come across it and go, wait, I have this. So if we have listeners in Fort Smith or anywhere that might
Anywhere.
know
Yeah.
of that newspaper edition and can come
Yeah.
across the article, share it with us, because
Yeah.
it would be interesting to see what his words were to know exactly what set her off for
Yeah.
And
for
what's
that
so
part of the
funny,
case.
what's so funny, I read years ago that a lot of times when the women would go on the suffragist marches, they would like a lot of times take a dose of their remedies before they go, because you know the I don't say snake oil remedies that were out, but they believed they were really healthy remedies. But most of them were very high content of alcohol. So chances are maybe Agnes took a swig of her fortifying remedy and actually was rather toasty at court. And maybe that's why she acted the way she did.
Could be.
Oh, by the way, I'm digging up my notes now, and the newspaper that printed the problematic story was the Fort Smith Times.
Okay.
That's October 4th, 1899.
And that's the article that you haven't been able to come across.
Right. I haven't found it. It's nowhere. It's not on FultonHistoryNewspapers.com, Chronicling America, any local database.
Oh.
And I've talked to a bunch of local Fort Smith librarians and historians, have not been able to
And they
find
can't find it either. So if somebody comes across the Fort Smith Times in their attic, specifically this issue, like I said, or their basement, or wherever people put that stuff, from their ancestors, you're cleaning out your like ancestor's house, look for that issue so we can find out what exactly he said that set her off to make her want to sue him for his words.
It was definitely about desecration of the grave.
Well, and in her mind, she wasn't desecrating it. She was making it right. And that's the other crazy part of it. For her, she was making it right because she didn't feel like it had been done properly. But of course, the other half of that faction was like, no, we did everything we said we were going to do. So that makes it an even more interesting thing. But the fact that she just took herself to the graveyard and said, we're just going to do this.
And again, I want you to see this illustration of the two graves, because it's comical. They just don't look different enough for you to believe that all this arose from a dispute over those.
It's crazy.
Women can be vicious.
They can be sometimes. As women, we know this. we can be rather nasty to each other if we want to be. We try not to. Most of us try not to be, but but there are some out there. And unfortunately, that's one of those things that hasn't always changed with time. So
Well, no, Arkansas, because I was going to say, it just popped into my head. If she was from Texas, then she may have been, on the side of the South, but then in Arkansas was also a Southern state.
Yeah,
so
those were all Southern states. And even, Etta sounds like, well, Etta came to Arkansas from New York, though, is what you said originally. But it sounds like her family was in Kentucky. So it sounds like these were all Southern ladies at some point.
That one may not have had the North and the South thing going.
Yeah. But, well, Hugh, this has been so much fun.
Yeah,
I'm so glad.
crazy.
I'm so glad you decided to go down these rabbit holes and look for this whole story to find out how it ended. And again, maybe one day you'll get to come across the actual article, and then you'll have the complete thing. But and for our historians and librarians in Fort Smith, you guys have to start telling this story. Anybody who's doing, the cemetery tours and stuff, this is one of those stories that should be added because it's a fantastic story.
I'm curious as
fiction, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
It's like stranger than fiction. You couldn't make up a story like this.
Yeah. I'm curious as to whether the historians there have incorporated this into any program since I first told them about it. I haven't heard anything about that, but maybe this podcast will be the tipping point that encourages them to do so. Yeah,
I'm hoping they do so, because this, like I said, if they're giving tours of that cemetery of Laurel Hill and all of that, this is definitely worth the stop on the tour, especially since, there is documentation to prove that the stones were changed, and they could share that with the the tour and things like that. Like this whole story is one of those, when you go on those types of tours, you want to hear.
Right, exactly.
And it just gives you
Yeah.
that glimpse into the past that makes us remember that they weren't all these staid, boring people that we sometimes think of historically. They had, yeah, they had things that made them do craziness too. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yes. So thank you, Hugh. We were so glad to have you back. Anytime, we're happy to have you on the show. Any of your stories we would love to hear more of. So
Yeah,
Thank you
now
so
I have
much.
to check out your podcast, because I didn't want to check out your podcast prior, because I didn't want to accidentally run into this episode. So now I gotta go check it out.
Yes. And while we have you, tell our listeners what your podcast is, and we'll make sure we link it in our show notes. People can go find you as well.
It's called Historic Headlines, and it's on Podbean.
Yes. So definitely go check it out. If you're looking for more podcasts to listen to, it's always nice to have additional content and everything. So we'll make sure we'll have that linked in our show notes, folks, so you can go and listen to it, and we'll stick it on we'll actually add it to our website as well. We have a running list that we keep adding podcasts to other podcasts too. So you'll be able to find the link on our website, but also in the show notes for this episode.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Dianne and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.